Good evening. I'm Doug Hicks, Dean of Oxford College of Emory University, and I thank you all for joining for this talk on leadership and for the conversation that will follow. This is part of the Emory Alumni Association live stream series, and we are so glad that you're here for this webinar. As I talk, and I'll talk for about 35 or 40 minutes presenting some ideas on leadership and the images of leadership, please type your questions in the question or chat box, and then we'll have 20 or 25 minutes for conversation, questions and answers. So I thank you all for joining, whichever part of the world you're coming from. And we're joined here in Phi Gamma Hall on the historic Oxford campus by a number of students who are doing leadership development as part of their tour guide duties as part of the admission process. We've got some faculty and staff friends here as well. So I'm really excited to be talking with you about leadership. Leadership education is a theme at Oxford College for our first year students and our sophomores. We're a small school as part of the Emory education, and we focus on small classes, close faculty student interaction, and particularly empowering students to take initiative in classes and in their co-curricular activities. So leadership is a theme that we emphasize a great deal. So thank you for joining us. Whether you're an Emory alum or an alum from another part of Emory, we're really glad you're here. So let's jump right on in. How do we imagine what leadership is, and how does that shape how we actually lead or follow? We know that each of us brings to leadership our own ideas of and images of what a leader is like, what a follower is like, what the leadership process looks like. And it's important that we understand our own images of leadership so that we can understand our own strengths and even our own biases and our own leanings as we think about who we would consider to be a leader or a follower. It also helps us to develop our leadership skills if we think about our conceptualizations of leadership, how we think about it. So the former president of Wellesley College and Duke University is named Nan Cohen. She argues in a book called Understanding Leadership that at least half of leadership, at least 50% of leadership, is how we think about it, how we frame it. If we're going to solve a problem before we start acting, it's how we think about it, what assumptions we bring, how we work on that issue. And then the other half that's very important, of course, is acting on that. So we have to have a good conception, and then we follow through on it. So I want to talk tonight about the idea of imagining what is possible and how we can lead to get there. And then also the same word, same root word, images. What are your images of leadership, and why does it matter? So here we go. We advance those slides. Okay, we're going to start with a racy statue, and this is Michelangelo's statue of David sitting in Florence, sitting 17 feet high. And this is not just the idealized human being, this is the idealized leader, the one who was shepherd, who then became king, King David, the one who reached into his satchel and pulled out a stone in this scene and threw a rock at Goliath. And he suddenly was identified as a leader, little David, shepherd boy, who was able to sling a rock, sling a stone, and slay the giant Goliath. And so we bring our understandings of leadership. This is one view, that we bring the idealized person, the perfect human being, the perfect body and the perfect mind, the strong one who somehow just out of nature steps up to be the leader. And I would suggest that for many of us in popular culture, that's the dominant understanding of leader. It's the great man who is physically strong, of great stature, who is dominant, and who also throws a good fastball. So this is David. And so that's one of the idealized images of leadership. But let's expand that. We've only got one person in this image. It's a perfect person, and it's a male person, strong person, and so forth. How do we widen our view of what leadership is? Well, we might instead think of leader and followers in our interaction. So when I ask my students to draw leadership, many draw a room like this with a person behind a podium, maybe like this one, who is reaching out to followers who are somehow different who are far away, and who are a mass, a group of people. And in this case, it's probably a classroom, but you could also imagine a preacher, a pastor, a priest standing behind or on a podium reaching the masses. So this understanding of leader and follower comes into play, but it's the leader who's the focus, who is the expert on some topic. So that idea of leader reaching out, teaching, or talking to followers is an important understanding of leadership. We'll take a twist on that, such as Dr. Martin Luther King in August of 1963 in the March on Washington. It's a leader standing in front of a group of followers, a mass of followers, but it's not just that the person behind the podium is an expert or is smart or who is able to deliver information. It's that the leader is inspiring, the leader is motivating, the leader connects through the word that we would know even all the way back to the Greek, charisma. Charisma, which in the Greek means gifts or talents, but in our sense in English, it often means a personal capacity to connect, to be inspiring, to be exciting. And so this is a dominant understanding of leadership, not just the person behind the podium, but the person who connects and inspires masses of people. Or how about this image of leadership? It's one of my favorites. It's the orchestra conductor. So it's the person who doesn't even play music, but who is in charge of making music. It's also inspirational, and it's technical. It requires a lot of skills. But the key component here is about bringing literally different voices, different sounds together to make some kind of harmony, to make some kind of symphony together. And so the orchestra conductor is less the center of attention than, say, Martin Luther King on the Mall in Washington speaking, but it's just as important a role of getting everyone to develop and express their own talents, and to do so not individually, but together. A really great image, and one I admire a great deal. And then another one that some of you may prefer, it's related to this, but it goes to sports, and it's the metaphor of team, and specifically it's about the coach. The coach who can call plays, the coach who understands her or his sport, the coach, even more importantly, who knows the talent on her team, who's able to bring the talent together to be greater than the sum of their parts. And coaches know their teams well. Coaches are able to motivate and inspire, just like those who stand with charisma. Some coaches are kind and quiet. Other coaches yell at their players, but they have to figure out what that relationship is all about. And so teamwork is one of the dominant themes in leadership studies. And I invite you to think about the ways in which you use teams to think about your own and to actually exercise your own leadership. But let's put the team image on its head and say, well, the leader's not the coach. The leader's the player who is the captain, or maybe the player is the superstar. In this image, it's Lionel Messi, one of the greatest soccer players in the world, still inspiring fans in Barcelona and his national team here in Argentina. And not only is he the best player on the pitch every time he steps out, but he also is able to bring the team together, whether it's the football club of Barcelona or the Argentinian national team. Now in Argentina, in this team, he was also widely criticized for not being able to bring the team together. So not all leaders are effective at all things, and that's I hope we can talk about that moving forward. But undoubtedly, he's a leader among the followers on his team. So those are different images, from the lone person standing who does the work himself to a number of ways of inspiring or connecting or informing followers to actually being a player on that team. These are different ideas, and they have different implications for your workplace or for your classroom or for your student organization or for your civic organization. So then let's look at structure. This is one of the tightest structures that we could think of. It's a hierarchical structure or system of leadership. So the CEO stands on atop, and then there are middle managers, and then there are employees at the bottom, and it's intentionally, the pyramid is intentionally drawn to show a kind of not only a tight structure, but a hierarchy of who's in charge. And the higher up the pyramid you get, the more successful you are, the more power you have, the more authority as a leader. It goes all the way back in thought to, say, the notion of the great chain of being into the Middle Ages in the West, where God was the top of the chain of being. And then you had monarchs, and then you had lords, and ultimately you had serfs or other people who were down in that chain of being. So that's a very tight structure. It doesn't feel very modern for you students. You're like, what is that pyramid? We don't tend to think so hierarchically in our structures anymore because we've seen there are lots of downsides. One of the upsides, people know their roles, and there's clarity of roles, but it comes at some cost. So what would a different structure look like? Well, how about a network structure? This is a much less hierarchical structure. And when you look at it immediately, it's harder to tell who the people who are powerful are. Is it the person with the most people around them? Actually, I don't think so. I think it's the most powerful nodes or people in something like this are those who are connected to the most other circles. Those who are connectors become the people who are powerful, not those at the top of a structure, but those who are the most networked. And this, of course, has all kinds of implications, including on social media or other networks, literally on the web. But it also works for organizations that are less hierarchical and more communal. So think about that as an image of leadership. This is very different than that pyramid, right? How about birds in flight or army troops marching? Someone is on point, but does that bird stay on point all the time? No, the birds rotate. They exchange the leadership model. So the bird at the front goes until it cannot go anymore, and then it drops off to the back of the left or the right, and then one of the other two birds at the front comes to the front. And you've got, Aristotle's model of rotational leadership, where people play a role, but only for a certain amount of time, and in Aristotle's case, only when they're middle-aged adults. So I'm feeling pretty good. This is my moment. But it's a much more egalitarian model of leadership. Do you see that? It's much more egalitarian because everyone takes a turn at the front. Or this is similarly in biking. And we know that a group of people on bicycles move most efficiently and most quickly over a certain amount of terrain by forming what's called a pace line. And so this peloton or clump of people are fastest when they rotate, when they share that leadership. You go as far as you can, as fast as you can, then you come to the back and let someone else do the pulling, as they say, the work up front. Now, is it fully egalitarian? No. Those who are stronger might be at point for a longer period of time, but everyone needs to pull their weight, or guess what? They get dropped. They get dropped from the team. So this is another team metaphor, but it's clearly rotating the leadership role. So those are some of the images of leadership, and I love to think about them. I love to think about how different they are. If you're talking about the great man, the lone leader who does it for everyone else, who carries the world, and deserves that power, believes he deserves that power, to something that's completely egalitarian with a rotating model, but lots of variants like the network model or the team model or the orchestra where people are using different gifts. And so I invite you to think about how those different images have different effects. And some models might be better for some situations than others, but I get ahead of myself. Let's look at some of the leadership theories of the 20th century. Really, we'll go chronologically, but to illuminate some of the different ways that people have thought about leadership. So if you go back to early 20th century and earlier, you really get this theory that's literally called great man, theory of leadership, and it really was in the West and most societies about men. So think the Michelangelo's David. That's what we're talking about here. So take Philip IV of Spain, as painted by Velázquez. Velázquez didn't really like the family and didn't always portray Felipe and his family that favorably, but he always portrayed them as incredibly strong. So being on a horse, a powerful animal, being above everyone else, being the one to literally be God's agent on the earth to lead the people. This is the idea of a great man leader, and it's that horseback image is a powerful one. I spent a lot of time in Richmond, Virginia, and there are pretty interesting discussions now about soldiers and others on horseback. And the Virginia Museum recently put a now famous former slave on horseback to kind of counter the discussions about the Confederate generals on horseback along Confederate Avenue. So don't think that we're just talking about leadership in the past. These debates about who is strong and using the horseback model and the leader above everyone else, they continue to be important debates about who can be a leader, what leadership is all about. So Thomas Carlyle, writing in the middle of the 19th century, talked about the commander over men, the one who could subordinate everyone else's will to him. That was the ablest man, the commander, the great man. So he wrote, now think about this notion of leadership today in our politics. Find in any country the ablest man that exists. Raise him to the supreme place and loyally reverence him. You have a perfect government for that country. You don't need a ballot box. You don't need parliament. You don't need voting. You don't need a constitution or any other machinery whatsoever, Carlyle says, because this great man will carry the country. I'm here to not do normative work, but to analyze and describe. But does anyone fit this understanding or self-understanding of leadership today? Well, actually, President Trump talks in a lot of this language of the great man. And love him or hate him, this is the conception of leadership that he puts forward. And so when he stepped forward as the Republican nominee in Cleveland in 2016, this is what he said. I have joined the political arena so that the powerful can no longer beat up on people that cannot defend themselves. Nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it. And he said, many people have been forgotten. They are forgotten voices in America. I am your voice. Do you remember this? Echoes through my mind because it was such a unusual and stunning use of this great man and someone claiming that he was the one who could lead the country. And again, I'm doing this descriptively so that we can understand these different approaches. But I will say it's a timely discussion. After the great man and from it came this notion of looking at traits. What traits make for a leader? So we don't, in the great man theory, people think, well, great leaders are just born and they're either discovered or they discover themselves, as David did with the stone that he could become. He was really talented and strong. So leaders are born, not made. Well, what are these? How do we get into that understanding? So corporations in the early 1900s. So after that Gilded Age, in the period of corporations rising in America, they wanted to, in business administration and business science, they were thinking about succession plans in their organizations. Well, who is the next leader? In whom should we invest to become the next CEO or titan of this industry, of this firm? And so they started to ask what traits and do studies about what traits would make for great leaders. And again, if you think back, Abraham Lincoln is seen as someone who, so that's earlier than this theory, but he's an example of someone who is seen for being really intelligent, brave, very tall. I don't know about the appearance one, you'll have to decide for President Lincoln, but he had a lot of these qualities that are seen as traits that make people successful as leaders. And so the emphasis, again, in the early part of the 20th century was on traits. And then how do you identify people who have those traits and you invest in them as leaders? But then the next phase, which really was the mid 20th century, and there were famous studies at The Ohio State University, for instance, on what behaviors make leaders successful. So you all in the SGA or in different student organizations here, or you all who are on the live stream who are in working for firms, what are the behaviors that make for success in your context? And so I'm not from the Ohio State, I'm from the state next door called Indiana. In Indiana, we play basketball. And so the movie Hoosiers, I hope many of you have seen it. The movie Hoosiers shows a coach who is able to show different kind of behaviors towards his players working towards a state championship. And the first thing you have to do, one kind of behavior is the task. What is the task at hand? Well, in basketball, it's calling X's and O's. It's knowing how to play defense. It's knowing how to teach people to dribble and rebound and play as a team. But it's also about relationships. It's about, when necessary, being a disciplinarian. But disciplinarians only get so far in leadership. They have to also have warmth and be able to exude relationship behavior that, as the coach says at the end, I love you guys. Coaches who are successful have to be able to connect. So one of the key spectrums, or spectra, if you will, in leadership on behaviors is the task and relationship. And so some of you, has anyone heard this phrase, discussion? Have you ever done a leadership exercise? Are you better at tasks or relationships? This is one of the approaches to leadership that come out of this era. And Gene Hackman's character in Hoosiers and scholars of leadership agree, in order to be a great leader, you have to be good at the task at hand and you have to be a people person. But sometimes the task is what you need to focus on. Other times it's relationships. So relational versus task-oriented behaviors is really important, and it continues to be important. And then a question of, are you a Democrat with a small d? Are you able to bring people together and be more egalitarian about doing things, bringing many voices into the discussion? Or are you an autocrat and you tell people what needs to happen, when it needs to happen, and you be insistent in that way? Those are different behaviors. And what we're going to get to next is to look at how those different behaviors might be good or bad in different contexts. So we come to the middle of the 20th century and we're coming to situational leadership, where context means a lot, where we need to think about the situation in order to think about and approach leadership. So in the early 1960s, mid-1960s, we get the Immigration and Naturalization Act. President Lyndon Johnson signs the act at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. The biggest wave of immigration since the early 19th century happens. People come from all over the world. At the same time, women are starting to enter the workforce in grand numbers. African Americans and other non-white citizens are taking on more and more leadership roles. We're going to talk a good bit about the U.S. civil rights movement as vital at this moment in a second. So the notion of the great leader being the white male middle-aged executive is over. And leadership scholars, management scholars are working about how to welcome many voices into the leadership rubric. And we continue to work on as a society and struggle with the issues today. Scholars 50, 60 years ago were asking, what situational factors matter? What demographic factors matter in a much more complex and diverse society? So how about this for a context? How about climbing Mount Everest? This is a situation, and you can imagine that democratic committee-driven leadership is not going to work here, is it? This might be a place where you want to have a strong captain or leader or Sherpa telling you what to do and how to survive. So context matters a great deal. And just think of this situation. Have you seen this picture before? It ran all over the papers in the most recent climbing season at Mount Everest. It's actually a tragic picture because all these climbers, many of whom were not professionals, many of whom weren't expert enough and had no business on the mountain, had paid their mountaineers $30,000, $40,000 to climb Mount Everest, right? Because that's the dream. And they get up there, these executives and other wealthy, affluent persons from around the world who had the means to do this. And they get up there, what do they find in nature, in extreme nature? They find a traffic jam. And this scene exposed many people to the elements, and a number of people died that day and many other days in the deadliest season of climbing Mount Everest ever. And so if we had a different topic on my next webinar, I'll talk about leadership in extreme situations. And one of the answers is, in this context, leadership really happens 3 weeks earlier. Leadership happens 10,000 feet lower. Leadership happens in preparation for this because you're in the death zone above 24,000 feet. No one literally has the oxygen going to their brain to be able to think straight. And I already said that leadership is at least 50% about thinking straight. So this is one example, an extreme example of when situational leadership matters, and you have to think about context. But let's come back down to earth and talk about the three central elements of leadership. So we started with the great man, we started with Michelangelo's David, and the leadership relationship only, or the leadership process only had one actor, right? It had the leader. But then we brought in the composer, the conductor and the orchestra, the coach and the team, and all of a sudden we had followers as well. And now I've been talking about context that matters so much. It's not just the leader and follower. The leader and follower at 28,000 feet are different than the leader and follower at ground level. The leader and follower in a classroom are different than a leader and a follower trying to get a legal brief in by a certain deadline to get their work done. So we have to think about context in the situation. So context, leaders, and followers, the three central elements in leadership. Now this may be the scariest photo for me in the deck. And in order for it to have that full effect, it requires a certain knowledge of context. So this is 1960. This is Arlington, Virginia. This is Dion Diamond at the lunch counter of the drug fair in Arlington. And he has a group of teenage white boys ready to beat the crap out of him. Why? Because he's dared to go as part of the lunch counter sit-in movement, as part of the civil rights movement. This is 1960. Greensboro, all over the South, this is happening by college activists. Dion was 19 years old at this time. He's been arrested 30 times in his life doing acts of civil disobedience like this. The American Nazi Party showed up and right after this photo was shouting at him, shouting racial epithets and so forth. This is a terrible moment in American history, except that it's also successful. And the sit-in movement, led by college students, almost all African American with some white allies, trained by the great James Lawson in the notion of nonviolent resistance, to have some success to integrate the lunch counters, where whites only was the policy. So in this case, the notion of context is blown up. We need to understand the historical context of fighting Jim Crow, the civil rights movement that was in full force in 1960. The contemporary context was specifically SNCC being active, college students really running with this, and the sit-in movement being a particular moment in the civil rights movement. And then the immediate context was the real, true life and death danger of Dion and others who did these sit-ins across the South. So again, context means everything. A different picture of someone at a lunch counter with people making an angry glance at them would not be scary, but if you know this context, it sure is. And then finally, as we come up into the 80s and 90s and the 21st century, ethics and values become the central language of leadership. And how do we think together about what kind of society will be, what justice looks like, how people from many religious faiths and none will get along together in what we might call a post-Christendom age, or at least an age in which Christianity is one religion, that still the largest by far religion, but many other faiths, spiritualities, and moralities of Americans trying to get along, and for that matter, the global context matters so much. So what does ethics and values look like in leadership? Well, remember 1995, the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City? For me, when you think of ethics and leadership, I often think of first responders. I think of those who are willing to go into contexts that the rest of us might be afraid to go into. And this is Chris Fields carrying the lifeless body of Bailey Allman in April of 1995. A tragic situation. 168 people died, including 19 kids in a daycare in this federal building. But the bravery, the question of, in terms of leadership, it is what qualities of bravery, of preparation, of willingness to take risks allow people to lead in this way, and how can we promote those kind of values among ourselves? Those are the questions we want to look at. And so a great professor and scholar of leadership named James McGregor Burns, the late Jim Burns from Williams College, someone I had the privilege of knowing a good bit and actually hosting at my home for dinner one time. Jim Burns is famous for his framework of transforming leadership, or transformational leadership. And that is the theory that is opposed to transactional leadership, where if my friend and student Avery wants something from me and I want something from him, we exchange A for B. And so there's an exchange relationship, but nothing enduring. We might make that, we do that all the time in economic transactions, social transactions. But transforming leadership, Burns says, is more than transaction. It's about when we come together, my level of motivation and my level of morality are lifted up because I've fused my sense of purpose with you. So it requires an investment in the other person as a human, for whatever background she or he or they come from. We learn from each other and raise each other up to higher levels to overcome conflicts. And so Burns wrote on conflict resolution, civil rights in this country, fighting poverty internationally, and so forth. And it's a powerful, this notion of transforming versus transactional leadership is a powerful one for thinking about morality. So let me just give you a couple of examples. So F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela win the Nobel Peace Prize for the work they did to transform from apartheid, whites only rule in South Africa, to multiracial democracy. And so when Mandela became president in 1994 through the first democratic election that included African blacks and other categories that were non-white in South Africa, he had a moment to set the tone for everyone in South Africa. And so during actually to close his presidential inauguration speech, he said this: "We place our vision of a new constitutional order for South Africa on the table, not as conquerors prescribing to the conquered. We speak as fellow citizens to heal the wounds of the past with the intent of constructing a new order based on justice for all." I hope you students and others, students of history and leadership, will read more about Mandela, his own Long Walk to Freedom, or even books about him like Playing the Enemy, in which it's discussed that Mandela took very careful, thoughtful steps to reach out to the Afrikaners and others who were enemies, who put him in prison for decades. He reached out to the South African rugby team, for instance, in famous and jarring images of cheering for what had been a whites-dominated sport in South Africa in order to cross bridges, even to the chagrin sometimes of his ANC colleagues who really did want a more a bigger flip, a bigger social inversion of power in the country, and he insisted on a more egalitarian, democratic, multiracial regime. And so, and of course, he's lifted up for that transforming leadership. Or consider Jacinda Ardern, who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And you remember what happened last spring in New Zealand? A terrorist, a white supremacist, opened fire on a mosque in Christchurch and killed 50 people. And many of them were immigrants. They were almost all Muslims who were in New Zealand. And he was trying to divide New Zealand and work against Muslims. And she went on, she's 38 years old, a brand new politician, a brand new leader of the country, and had a press conference and was absolutely remarkable. What gave her the power, the strength, the inner sense of ethics and justice to step up in that moment? And she said, those in a New Zealand Kiwi accent, those directly affected by the shooting may be migrants to New Zealand. They may even be refugees here. They have chosen New Zealand as their home, and it is their home. They are us. The person who has perpetrated this violence against us is not. And she went on to say this person who perpetrated the violence had no place in New Zealand and so forth. Powerful words from someone who completely did not expect this kind of terrorist action, and she stepped up. What makes it possible for someone like that to step up? What are their ethics, and how do we think about that in a leadership framework? So, covered a lot. We covered leadership theories in the 20th century, and I covered at the beginning a whole set of images of leadership. And so, what's another word that ties to image? And that is to imagine. For me, leadership isn't just about thinking, it's not just about acting. Above all else, it's about imagining. It's about imagining a different reality than the one in which we're sitting. And that might be something mundane like, how do we raise more money for the class gift at Oxford College? How do we get from that? I talked to a student this morning about that. How do we get from A to B? How do we get this group project done as a group on campus? Or how do I get this group project done at my firm in work? So you have to imagine that reality and you have to get there. Or maybe it's imagining a different racial demographic and a more inclusive society in this country. Maybe it's imagining a solution to the coronavirus, in which Emory doctors right now and scientists are working to try to address that. But we have to imagine a different world. So I'm going to close with a couple of ideas and then open it up for questions. I hope we have some. Think of Lin-Manuel Miranda, the liberal arts graduate from Wesleyan University, who wrote this incredible, the most popular musical around right now, perhaps in history, Hamilton. He took images of the founding fathers of the United States and he turned them on their head. He completely reimagined the narrative of Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison and Washington and used a very diverse cast. And he wrote this beautiful score. And if we had the rights to it, I'd play it for you right now. But he took images that were familiar to all of us, but played them in a different key. He has us now. Hamilton is a metaphor. It's a beautiful set of images for us to think about leading in a different way and a more inclusive society. For me, it's one of the better understandings of how we reimagine something very dear to us, keep true to those roots, but have it fit the current context. So, coming to a close, and I hope you all have some ideas for conversation. Think of the various images we've covered, from the individual to the group, from the hierarchical to the egalitarian, to crisis leadership to mundane leadership, like playing a piece of music. How do those fit together? What are the images that you bring in your head that you brought into the talk today, that you operate with in your workplace or at your religious group or your family or your classroom? How do you do that? I've also intentionally tried to use images of persons who have who don't all look alike. who don't all look like me or others in this group, but to show people from different backgrounds, different traditions, different ages, who are able to have seized a leadership role and to succeed. So the opening picture, students, was an unfocused picture of you all, but we really want you to imagine yourselves in the leadership equation, and that's why we teach Learning to Lead and Leadership Oxford and all the other things we do to develop leadership. And for those of you Emory alumni on the web now, you are also part of the story, and you may not look as good as the students. I'll leave that up to you all. But you all are part of leadership. And so the question I ask to you all is, what are your images of leadership, and where are you in the story? Where are you in the story? So I'm going to stop there. I hope this is of interest to you. I hope it gives you a lot of food for thought, some of the building blocks of leadership from leadership studies. And let's see what questions or comments you have. So my friend Lane has been collecting questions. I know there may be some questions in the room too. Do you want to jump in? So some bad examples of leadership seem to have more staying power today than good examples of leadership. And how can we understand this, and how can we change it? It's a great question. It's a hard question, and there are, I wish I had an easy answer for it. There are scholars who write on things like toxic leadership, and what is it about leaders who are toxic, who do damage to others, who play on people's weaknesses, that allows them to continue to be successful or even to thrive in a society. And it takes an analysis on the psychological front. It takes an analysis on like group behavior for us to think about this. And the best answer I could give to this question is that if we think about leadership, if we talk about it together, we bring the ethical question to the forefront, which is so important. We bring an inclusive model of leadership to the forefront. We might have the vocabulary to say no, say to bullies, or to those who feed on our weaknesses, or those who seek to take advantage of others. And so that's the challenge. I would commend to any of you this book, Toxic Leadership by Jean Lippman Blumen, another book called Followership by Barbara Kellerman, that each talks about this question of why people follow bad leaders. And I'll just add this, and then I'll take the next one. Charisma is a powerful, powerful thing. People who have the ability to connect in a strange way, in a powerful way with others who become their followers. But charisma is morally neutral. Charisma can be used for fantastic ends, where, and MLK is just one example, it's the one I used. People follow for ends that are noble and towards justice. But people say Adolf Hitler was charismatic and could pull people together from the rallies and from other things. And those are just extreme examples of how charisma can pull people in either direction. We need the moral compass to be able to say no to those who would lead in bad directions. How do introverts lead? Very quietly. No. That's an interesting question. And there is a literature on is extroversion a positive mark to help people to become leaders. And there are situations in contexts in which being an extrovert is a helpful thing. Leading a group, leading in crisis, speaking in front of large groups. These are all places where extroversion is helpful. But introversion, being an introvert, is also a plus, and it's a plus in a different way. It may help people to listen better because they're not talking as much. It may help people to be more sensitive or attuned to the people around them, including introverts who have a lot of gifts but aren't going to be the first one to speak up in a class. And the question also, to me, takes me to the importance of understanding ourselves. So part of this question of images, the inherent in everything I'm asking you to understand your own images of leadership, is to invite you, to challenge you to ask questions about yourself. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What do you love to do? What do you hate to do? And where do you want to go? And understanding an introvert can be quite helpful. And so that's one of the things is if you understand your tools, or to use the symphony metaphor, if you understand what instrument you play, what instrument you're good at, you're going to be more effective. But introverts can definitely be good leaders. Okay, so my corporation keeps wanting to flip the leadership pyramid, asking followers to think more like leaders. What do I think of this, and is it a sustainable model? Is that the question? Okay. It can be. It's a noble effort to get people across an organization to think that they have agency. So that's the best part. That's the good side of this question, or that approach, is to say, wherever you are in the pyramid, if you will, you matter and your ideas matter. And so again, coming back to thinking and sharing ideas, I've seen this used in different ways. Sometimes it unfairly puts line workers, if you will, on the spot and holds them accountable for decisions that need to be made higher up. Or sometimes it's one of my colleagues and fellow students of leadership, Joanne Chula, talks about bogus empowerment. So sometimes language of empowerment, empowering followers, empowering people at the bottom of the pyramid, is more talk and less action. So I would also ask that question, but I'll end with this. I'm not sure a pyramid is the best structure for leadership. So instead of talking about inverting the pyramid or empowering the bottom of the pyramid, how about blowing up the pyramid and creating networks or creating structures that aren't quite so hierarchical? And if anybody has a question in the room, we can take that and mix it in. Go ahead. So what are some leadership styles that are effective that is for a district going through education reform? Okay. The first thing I would think about is how to get meaningful input from citizens who live in this district and connect that to people who are actually decision makers. And again, we need to avoid bogus ways for citizens to give input, and we need to find ways for meaningful interaction. So there are people who want to do a lot of town halls and gather a few hundred people in a room to have a public hearing, and I'm not sure those are always the best ways to get input from a public on any kind of issue. So to find ways to get meaningful input from the public, then to have leaders who are willing to make decisions, and then to close the loop by coming back and being transparent about why those decisions were made. Those would be the first set of things I would think about. How do you know when you're making the right decision for a group of diverse people? First thing I think of with that question is to have some confidence and willingness to not know, and willingness to move forward when you don't have the complete pulse of a group. So one of the most paralyzing features of leadership, and I've seen it among people I admire very much, is the inability to act because of a quest for not just consensus, but unanimity, to try to bring everyone along and to have them be on board. And the other piece, I think, would be a quest to be liked by everyone. And so I, of course, speak as a higher ed administrator and gave up on the idea that I could be liked by everyone a long time ago because they're hard, and that's partly a joke, but it's partly true because there are a lot of competing constituencies in a leadership position. So I think the more diverse the group is, the more listening is important, and the more structure for genuine input, not bogus empowerment, but genuine input is important. And I'll just say it's one of Emory's strengths. In particular, it's one of Oxford's strengths to bring people from a remarkably diverse set of demographic features and to create a truly inclusive community. So there's no substitute for asking for people's opinions and creating fora. And if it's a small group, it's different than a large group for how you get people's voices to be heard. But to come back to the idea that you've got to have a circle where you get input, you involve people in decisions, and then you share that decision with everyone openly, and then start over for the next thing, constant improvement. That's the kind of virtuous circle that needs to be formed. Any questions in the room? Scott, do you have one? What makes a good follower? So interestingly, I think in common discussion about leadership, we think about leaders and followers as opposites, as two ends of the leadership process, if we think about followers at all. But the scholarship on followership makes us learn that to be a good follower is very much like being a good leader. It's about being involved, about being willing to do the hard work. It's about being thoughtful, showing critical thinking, being good at working in groups, being a good listener. But then leaders are a little bit different in terms of being more willing to speak in front of groups, being willing to be accountable for decisions that are made. So perhaps being a little bit more willing to take risks. But in general, the qualities of a good follower are the qualities of a good leader. And so what's the opposite of a good leader and a good follower? Well, the literature often talks about sheep. And sheep are those who just kind of stand around and can be herded, but aren't making a lot of decisions. They go with the group and so forth. So to move follower over to be like leaders is pretty important. One of my favorite lessons in leadership, and I love it when we get to a followership topic because I tell the story, so I'll tell it to you today. And I'll say it's rooted in truth. I was flying from Boston down to Richmond, Virginia, and we had to do a stopover in Philadelphia. But when we got it up in the air, the person next to me in the next seat said, I think the wing is frozen. And I said, I don't really want to talk to you because I'm on an airplane and I didn't have, a phone at that point because this was, a long time ago. And I didn't pay much attention. But then I noticed the drink carts didn't come out. And then the pilot came out from the cockpit and was looking over our shoulder at the wing. And sure enough, the wing was frozen and the flap would not go up. So we could not land. And so we're flying around and they started saying, we're going to have to make a crash landing and we're going to JFK because it's 2 miles long, the runway, and they can land the Concorde there. For you students, that was a supersonic plane. So we can slow down and with the flaps in the takeoff position. So for the next half hour, the flight attendants had us practice brace position and buckling and unbuckling our seatbelt. A half hour of buckling and unbuckling our seatbelt practicing and leaning our heads against the seat. This was not my favorite moment in my life, but it makes me think. I didn't think about it at the time. I was thinking about other things like, wow, what are we going to do? And why didn't I listen to this person who said the wing was frozen? Here's the question. Were we passengers on that airplane followers? I can't answer that question for you because I think you could debate it either way. Of course, we were followers. We were listening. We were practicing. They told us to buckle and unbuckle our seatbelts. That's what we did. But I think I lean towards saying we were not followers at all. We were just doing what we were told. And why were they telling us to buckle and unbuckle our seatbelts and to practice leaning forward? Because they didn't want us to panic. They needed to give us something to do. So I didn't feel like we were followers in that process. We were just being obedient, and we were following directions, but we weren't doing anything. Of course, you say, well, we didn't panic, which was good for the process, but you get the idea. So followers are those who take agency, who do stuff, and who are part of a positive process to get stuff done. Any more questions online? Okay. I want to say thank you on behalf of Emory University for tuning into this webinar. I want to say thank you on behalf of Oxford College. And if you have anything that you'd like to talk about further, please email me at oxforddean@emory.edu. Oxforddean, that's all one word, at emory.edu. And I want to thank you all for tuning in, and also you students and colleagues from Oxford for being here. So we're signing off. Thank you very much.